Now, on Simon Case, it is interesting that this story's emerged this week because Simon Case is under pressure. There is a lot of chatter in Whitehall about whether he is the right man to continue in that job as the head of the civil service. He's obviously been facing a lot of questions in recent weeks because the Sunday Times has been reporting on Boris Johnson's secret loan arrangement when he was in Number 10. And obviously Simon Case provided advice to Boris Johnson about that loan. There's also the issue of the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, and his involvement in that. And again, Simon Case was involved in this. So there is certainly a sense among some people in government that Simon Case is under pressure. And I do happen to know that there are some people around Rishi Sunak who are not particularly happy with how things are panning out in the Cabinet Office.
Right.
On Simon Case's side of things, from what I'm told by people, who work with him, I think he is feeling the pressure in the sense that I think he feels personally as though he's stuck in the middle of what's being referred to as Tory wars, which is this back and forth between various competing factions of the Conservative Party, and he's somehow been dragged into all of it.
Well, I mean, what this all sort of comes down to, presumably, is Rishi Sunak coming into post in a rush amid chaos after a period of even greater chaos, after 2 years of general chaos, and so I guess he made a lot of appointments very quickly because they were the people that, for political reasons, he had to put in place. That involved getting Dominic Raab back, that involved keeping Nadeem Zahawi, that involved Suella Braverman, and all these choices that perhaps if he'd had more time to think and approach it all more calmly, he might have made a bit differently. He's now paying for, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. He does seem to be paying for that in a big way. The front pages over the last 4 weeks have been dominated by these kinds of stories. First it was Suella Braverman, then it was Nadeem Zahawi, now it's Dominic Raab, and Dominic Raab beforehand, and now he's back. One thing I would say, I don't really think... I understand the arguments being deployed by Number 10 about the Prime Minister is just trying to follow due process. I do think, however, that critics do have a legitimate case to make when they say, well, does the Prime Minister not read the newspapers? These stories about Nadeem Zahawi and Dominic Raab. The Dominic Raab stuff wasn't known when he was reappointed, but Nadeem Zahawi certainly was. And you do have to question, was it worth it?
Was it worth the easy fix at the time?
Exactly.
With this lying over, look, we had Boris Johnson on Talk TV last night, and he was, among many other things, he was saying that the government should reduce the tax burden to trigger economic growth. A very Liz Truss-ish position, one might say. I know there are many other Conservative MPs who were worried that, well, not worried or insistent that taxes should come down. Well, I guess, firstly, what do you make of Boris Johnson's kind of entry into this? Do you think, is this something he's been wanting to do, or was he just on telly and had to say something?
That's a good question. We'd need to ask Nadine Dorries whether it was a planted question.
We'll get it down.
We should indeed. I think he chose his words quite carefully, but deliberately. So he didn't say we must cut taxes in the budget, but he used words which he knew would be interpreted by people like you and I as being a hint that he wants to see taxes come down soon.
Yeah.
And the reality is that a lot of his allies in Parliament, lots of the Tory MPs still loyal to him, are the ones making those calls for tax cuts now. So it's interesting that he's coming back now. He's obviously already caused a degree of irritation on the foreign side, the foreign policy side of things, by going to Ukraine and kind of treading where the Prime Minister really should. It will be interesting to see whether he makes any further interventions prior to the budget. What I think is also interesting, aside from Boris Johnson, is Liz Truss and how she...
the return of Liz Truss.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, well, so what can you tell us about that? Because I mean, as we were saying earlier, if I was Liz Truss, I just wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to see what she has to gain. She must have had such a humiliating experience as Prime Minister, and for her to think that she can rescue all that with with a few articles in Sunday newspapers, it seems very strange to me.
That's true. I think the reality with Liz Truss is she's somebody who's overcome a lot of adversity over a number of years, and she's got skin as thick as a rhinoceros. And she basically spent the last 3 months in relative hibernation. But my understanding is she's about to publish a piece, I think, in the Sunday Telegraph tomorrow, saying basically, while she accepts that the timing of what she did in that mini budget was perhaps too fast and too much, she doesn't accept that her ideas were wrong. And I think we're going to be seeing some of the arguments she deployed as Prime Minister coming out again about the Office for Budget Responsibility and these institutions that are there to safeguard the economy being terrible and needing to be scrapped. But what will be interesting is if she uses that piece also to set out a completely competing economic prospectus to the one that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak are going to be pursuing in 5 weeks' time. Because if she does, I think there could be a few fireworks in the Conservative Party again.
We'll talk about the tax cut aspect of that in just a second. But from her perspective, what do you think? Is she trying to rehabilitate herself and get back to have the potential of a career in frontline politics, or does she think that's gone now? But there's still some reputational sort of reparation she can do.
I think there is a degree of, at some point, I don't get the sense that she thinks she's going to be back anytime soon while Sunak is still Prime Minister. But I think she is trying to rehabilitate her image. She's trying to defend her, albeit very short, legacy.
Yeah.
And I think she will look at what's happening in the warnings from the IMF and the Bank of England this week about growth, economic growth, and where we're heading, and the recession dragging on for a long time. And she'll probably be making the argument that I was right, I just moved too fast. That's what I think she's trying to convey, that she was right. She ended up becoming entirely associated with economics during her time as Prime Minister, which is funny because she was never Chancellor, and but she always aspired to be. So this seems to me about it's an argument over economics ultimately.
And look, from the perspective of the rest of the Conservative Party, I mean, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister was not like, he wasn't like a great tax-cutting Prime Minister. Was he even particularly on that side of the argument? He was a fairly high-spending Prime Minister. I mean, I guess COVID affected that, but you never really got the sense that his mission was to drive down taxes in this kind of way. Is this just politics?
So, yeah, I mean, famously, obviously, under Boris Johnson, they broke the triple tax lock pledge, which was not to increase income tax, VAT or national insurance. And they ended up hiking national insurance. And the reality is, I think Boris Johnson was very good on the rhetoric on, I want to cut your taxes. But what he came up against is, as you said, he wanted to spend billions and billions of pounds on massive projects and big infrastructure investment. And what he had in number 11 was a chancellor who was saying, well, actually, Prime Minister, we don't have the money to do this. And if you're going to do that, you need to raise taxes. And so he acquiesced. And that's why. So you're right. I mean, I think Boris Johnson thinks of himself as a low tax Conservative. Right. The reality, however, when he was in office was very different.
And look, we have a budget next month coming up. What are the chances of that having any sort of tax cutting aspect to it? Is that something Jeremy Hunt is going to be keen on, or just sort of avoiding like the plague, considering the nation's finances more generally?
So I'm writing about this tomorrow, so I'm quite well briefed on it. And what I can say is I think the idea of any personal tax cuts is completely out the window in March. So anything to do with your own income tax or otherwise, not going to happen. And Hunt, but also this also extends to things like business taxes. I mean, Hunt talked in recent days in interviews about he wanted to prioritise pre-profit business taxes. That's like business rates, employer contributions on NICs. But even that, I'm told, is off the table because he just doesn't have the money, the fiscal headroom to do that. And obviously we've had these very bad economic forecasts this week. I'm told that Hunt has actually now just received his first OBR forecast. It's the kind of private ones they get before the budget. And the outlook is as bleak as feared. Tax revenues for kind of 24, 25, the financial year onwards, are down significantly because as the economy slows, so do the amount of money they accrue in tax also drops. So, for one example is the windfall tax, the on oil and gas companies. There's a huge hole that's been blown in the revenues there. So, to answer your question, I don't think we're going to see any meaningful tax cuts. I'm not sure we're going to see many meaningful spending announcements either. And the question is, can he really deliver a budget with not much in it, certainly not much in it with anything to do with growth, and placate all those Conservative MPs who want to see exactly that?
I mean, what does that mean? That means that he'd be gearing up for another one before an election. Would he make promises this time that, like, bear with me now, this is a difficult time, but next time around, well, I'll come good in time for Britain to go to the polls?
I think he would like to be in that position. I think they certainly want to do business taxes before the next election, maybe in 2024. I don't even think he's going to be able to commit to personal taxes just because they raise so much revenue to cut them before. I think they are in a very uncertain place right now as we kind of continue to drag into recession. And so I think he's going to be very careful about what he commits to.
Yeah.
So the reality is it's looking quite bleak, actually.